So I am back once again with another video in my Escalation series, this time focused on an Errantry Crusade list for Bretonnia. If you've seen my previous videos, you know I follow a few basic rules that most Escalation leagues follow. I follow a basic format where I start with 500 points, then 1000 points, 1500, and finally 2000. Following basic Escalation rules, once I add a unit, I cannot remove it from future lists. So if at 500 points I include a unit of squires, that means at 2000 points I must include at least one unit of squires as well. It could be bigger, it could be smaller, it could have a different loadout, but there must be one unit. The same rule holds true for heroes, but you can upgrade them, downgrade them, mount them, dismount them, etc. So if I start out with a damsel in my 500 point list, that means in my 2000 point list I must have at least one damsel or one prophetess. Please note that your own Escalation League probably has their own rules. I'm just trying to keep this as generic as possible, so if there's anything I build here that doesn't fit into your league, adjust accordingly. This is also the first Escalation list I've done for an army that comes from the Arcane Journals, and I've decided to really lean into their themes. So in the Grand Army list, I tried to get all types of units within the list so a beginner can pick up and learn the game. I am not going to do that here. This is going to be a pure mounted cavalry list. If you are a beginner to Bretonnia or Warhammer in general, I strongly suggest going back and watching my Grand Army video and trying that first. Okay, now that that is all out of the way, let's start getting to the fun stuff, starting with what makes an Errantry Crusade different. There are 4 distinctive things to keep in mind when making an Errantry Crusade list. 1. Your core now has to be 33% of your point total rather than 25. 2. Crusader's Zeal. 3. Crusader's Vow. And finally, number 4. Earn Your Spurs special rule. The larger core tax might not seem like much, but those extra points really add up. Ultimately, it's going to boil down to less magic items for your heroes, and maybe even a less Grail Knight or 2, or one less Pegasus Knight, which can be a huge drawback. And speaking of drawbacks, Crusader Zeal is a huge one. Although it comes with a boost in charge range and a boost in combat resolution on the charge, it comes with a high price of Impetuous. Impetuous is one of the worst drawbacks in the game. It means that 50% of the time your unit is going to charge whether you want them to or not, and it makes it really easy for your opponent to bait out certain unit of yours into bad situations. So much of this game is won and lost in the movement phase, so to lose agency over the movement and charging of your own troops is a huge drawback and something you're going to have to play around with this list. Crusader's Vow, at least, is a pure buff and is something you're going to use in this list by default. If I don't call out a vow when I go through my list, just assume the unit is using this one. And finally, we have Earn Your Spurs, which is what makes this list fun. In short, this means that your Knights Errant get to reroll 1s on their 2-hit rolls as long as they are near a Lord or a Knight with the Grail Vow, and they get double points if they capture an enemy standard. If we take all of these things together, it means our Knights Errant are going to be much more efficient point for point than our Knights of the Realm now, and so there's really not a lot of use for a Knight of the Realm in this list. But a big caveat to this is we are exchanging the counter charge we get with our Knights of the Realm for first charge, which is really going to change up how you play your Knights, just something to keep in mind. This means that during the game, we're going to have a hard time with positioning, with being forced in the charges we don't want to take, and being forced to charge into ambushes even though we don't want to be there, unless we make effective use of screening. And if you don't know what I mean by screening, please watch this next part, because if you're going to play this list, you need to know. Let's say this triangle represents a Bretonnian lance, and that red rectangle is an enemy unit we don't want to charge. As things stand right now, because the lance has line of sight and is in charge range, whether I want to charge or not, there is a 50% chance it makes the charge. Now let's go over the same scenario, but this time we have a cheap unit between the two. This unit is called a screener, and on top of being cheap, it should also be mobile. In Bretonnia's case, this is probably squires or mounted yeomen. Our lance no longer has direct line of sight and thus does not have to make an impetuous roll. Now, there are a lot of factors that would determine what happens next, but in the ideal scenario, your opponent would try to charge your mounted yeomen, they would fire and flee and go safely behind your lance. The opponent's charge is failed and you are safely able to charge on your turn in a better situation. And now let's move away from my amazing graphics and into the actual lists. So at 500 points, we keep things very simple because at 500 points it's almost impossible not to. We take a mounted paladin as our general, mostly because we have to be a legal Errantry Crusade list. But we lean into our strengths, giving him both a lance and virtue of the joust, so he hits hard on the charge. Now, the rules for earn your spurs aren't super clear on this, but the rule says that all lords of Bretonnia will trigger that reroll, and I am taking that to mean every duke, every baron, and every paladin is a lord, so this guy doesn't have to have the Grail virtue, but can still trigger rerolls on our knights errant. I'm opting to bring a damsel here, even though that means my units are going to have a pretty low model count, and this list is going to be kind of top heavy. But ultimately, I thought a damsel could have more of an effect of the game than a couple more knights errant. I'm using illusion here with the idea that I'll take my default spell and I'll replace the other one with Wrath of the Lady, and I'll basically use her as a buff machine for my knights. But the other schools of magic are very nice as well, feel free to experiment. For my core, I'm bringing a couple of units of knight errant, and I have a standard with them and a champion, trying to get them as strong as I can. The kind of goal with this 500 point list is I want to charge hard, I want to charge early, and I want to break them fast. Because we have our knights errant in a lance formation, it is a lot easier for us to combo charge than other races can, so we're going to try to put everything at one unit and break it. And finally, we're bringing some mounted yeomen to screen for our knights. My guess is that people are going to want to make a knights only list, a nobility only list, and not bring any peasants at all, and therefore not bring these yeomen. But I would urge you to reconsider. These units are very efficient, but more importantly, it can help screen our knights so we don't get taken in by impetuous, and so we can maintain our agency throughout the game, or at least maintain more agency than we'd have otherwise. We are going to have to make impetuous rolls no matter what, but with a couple screeners, at least we have some control. If you still decide you want a knights only list, you can drop these yeomen, but you'll probably also have to drop the damsel. The rules say you need a 3 unit minimum, and you're going to need the extra points to fit another unit of knights, whatever they may be. But if you are sticking with the list as I have it, the goal and strategy is pretty simple. We want to buff up our knights, and we want to combo charge something we think we have an advantage on and get those victory points. With 500 points and the paladin and the damsel both, this will be a pretty overwhelming charge for most things. Pretty simple and pretty fast, but at 1,000 points, things get a little more interesting. So I'm going to show 2 versions of this 1,000 point list, but this one's by far my favorite. With our extra points, we're going to get our core up to a legal level, and then we're going to split those points into our characters and adding some Grail Knights. Our damsel has been upgraded to a prophetess, but we are roughly going to run her in the same way. We're just going to put her in a bus of Grail Knights now instead of Knights Errant. Plus, she is level 4, and we're giving her the prayer icon, which should help you shut down your opponent's magic quite often. Our paladin has got quite the come up as well. He is now the BSB, he has the Crusader's Tapestry, and he has the Crusader's Clarion. And what that means is whatever Knights Errant unit you put him in will be an absolute beast on the charge. And don't forget that your paladin will grant some reroll ability to your Knights Errant that are in close proximity thanks to Earn Your Spurs. And speaking of Knights Errant, you can now see we're running 2 groups of 8. Trying to maximize what we're getting out of our lance, and one has a musician, one does not. That's purely for points reasoning. I just couldn't fit in both. Our mounted yeomen remain unchanged. We're just going to use this unit as a screener. If you feel like you don't need a screener at 1,000 points, you can use it to harass, to mess up war machines, whatever you need it to do. They're mobile, they're cheap, they have a lot of uses, but the main thing is use them to screen your knights. Last but certainly not least, we have our Grail Knights, the unit all knights aspire to, and the big hitter of this list. I mean, ultimately, you're playing an Errantry Crusade list. They're all hammers. There's no anvils, but this is your hammerist hammer. I would put the damsel here, but honestly, it might be good to put the damsel in the other Knights Errant unit as well, because this thing on its own with the war banner is still already strong. I would advise you to try to pick your targets well. I know it's hard, all your units have impetuous, but ideally, you want the Grail Knights to charge and fight things you don't trust your Knights Errant on, and units that you think your Knights Errant will come out on top on, especially if they have a banner, you want your Errants to charge, not your Grail Knights, or at least do a combo charge. And do remember that all your Grail Knights do have the Grail Vow and help trigger the reroll for your Knights Errant. The second list I don't love as much. I don't like bringing big monstrous cavalry to 1,000 points game, but I feel like that's more common with the old world and people are excited to play with the new models, so here it is. Feel free to experiment, give it a shot. But my honest opinion is there aren't enough points here to really kit out your Baron or really kit out your Grail Knights. Instead, we have half of each. And speaking in generalities, that doesn't tend to work out as well as fully investing into one unit. But still, at 1,000 points, a Baron, even without a lot of magical items, can be a pain for your opponent to deal with. And your Grail Knights at 3 strong, as long as you can keep them from getting shot off the table, can still do a lot of damage. At 1,500 points, we basically just want to bend the list around adding flying units in our Pegasus and our Baron if you didn't add him at the previous point level. In this particular list, you can see the Baron is there. He's still a threat on the tabletop, but he's not as fully kitted out as he might be. If within your gaming group you're expecting your opponents to really go ham on their large monsters at this point level, you might want to shave off points elsewhere and try to make him into a monster hunter, probably taking away Grail Knights. Otherwise, he is still useful as is, even if we can't afford to really invest in him as we'd like to. Place him with your Pegasus Knights and use him as a force multiplier. What is honestly really nice about a Baron kitted out like this is because you're about half the investment of a fully kitted out Duke, you don't feel as much pressure to make sure he's getting his points worth on every turn. And this means you feel less pressure to take big risks with him and are more likely to use him where he's most efficient. The Paladin is kitted out the exact same as before, but that's okay, he's perfect, we don't want to change him anyways, he's precious. With his current kit, and first charge, and earn your spurs, there aren't many units that won't buckle under the weight of a charge of his Knight Errant's unit. The hard part will be making sure the unit you charge is the one you want to charge, and that your opponent doesn't take advantage of impetuous. Which, to be clear, is very hard to do in this list. Our Prophetess has been downgraded back to a Damsel, but this is only because I needed the points elsewhere. This is one of those things, if you feel like your group is going hard into magic and you're going to need those level 4 dispels, add it back here and find your points somewhere else. To fill out our core tax, we are just adding more Knights Errant. Now we have one group with a musician. Probably put your Paladin here and 2 without them. And of course, the main reason for all the character shuffling, we added our Pegasus Knights. Pegasus Knights are pretty much undisputed as the best unit in the game right now. It's hard not to love them. It is hard to justify building a Bretonnia list without them. I would, however, recommend not bringing more than 1 unit to a game in an Escalation League. They are fast, they can charge in any direction, they are highly mobile, and they can do almost anything. They will be your MVP in most matches. But keep in mind that just like your other Knight units, this does have impetuous, and you will have to deal with that. We add 5 more mounted yeomen to help with our impetuous woes as much as they can. They can also do a lot of pot shots. They are very efficient for their points no matter what you do with them. They're good to have around. And then if you use the alternative 1,000 point list, we buff up the Grail Knights just a little bit to make them more of a threat. But unfortunately, we can't afford to keep the war banner. And that's our 1,500 point list. So we finally reached the end of our road and we have a full crusade at 2,000 points. There are enough zealous knights in this list to make Richard the Lionheart himself jealous, but at times that will cause you a lot of frustration due to impetuousness. The Baron has been upgraded to a noble duke and we've kitted him out to be a great monster hunter. This is the only knight in our list without Crusader Zeal, so it is the only unit of any note that has an easy time picking out its own target, which is why it has to take the role of a monster hunter. The virtue of heroism is going to ensure that he's great at killing enemy dragons. The Great Helm is going to help keep him alive. And we are bringing the Falcon Horn because the Falcon Horn is broken. For 40 points, if you can shut down your opponent's dragon for just one turn, you've made your points back in spades. If, for whatever reason, you don't want to take the Falcon Horn or don't think it'll be useful for you, switch that out with Syrian's Locket to protect your Duke from multiple wounds. And you should still have a few more points to place elsewhere. Our lovely damsel is now back up to a prophetess. We're still using her the same way. I like Lore of Illusion. I like using Wrath of the Lady. I like using damsels as a buff bus, but honestly, you can do so many different things with magic in this edition. Do what's right for you. There's a lot to experiment with. But if you do decide to use her like I do, stick her with your Grail Knight still. That'll make sure she's in the thick of things. That'll make sure that she can dispel most of what your opponent wants to do, especially with the added range given to us by the prayer icon. Our Paladin is still perfect, but I've also added a Biting Blade, and this is mostly because I had the room for it, but if he gets in sustained combat, this could come in very handy. This list is pretty top heavy overall, but that's pretty normal for the old world. I think you'll find most people's lists are going to look like this as well, but it also means you got to protect your characters because if one goes down, it's going to hurt. To make our core attacks complete, we just added another unit of Knights Errant. I am running a Crusade list here. I still prefer Errants in the core over anything else. If you're playing in a league that only allows up to 3 copies of a single unit, or if you just rather have some diversity for lore reasons or for aesthetic reasons, you can also take out one of these 8 units of Knight Errant and replace them with 6 Knights of the Realm, and you get about the same point level and you can make that work. We've added one more Noble Knight to our unit of Pegasus Knights. Obviously, at the ideal, we'd have 5 here. It's just hard to squeeze in the points. It's definitely hard doing an Errantry Crusade because they have that higher core tax, but 4 is what we could fit. If you were dead set on having 5, you could take some of the points out of your characters, but 4 can still wreak plenty of havoc. And then the last few units, our mounted yeomen stay the same. They do what they do. And then we have our 5 Grail Knights. And unfortunately, I couldn't find a way I like to fit a war banner here, but it would be nice to have a war banner here. Maybe if you don't like the Falcon Horn, that might be someplace you can take out those points and put them here in the Grail Knights. Ultimately, I don't think the Errantry Crusade is quite as strong as the Grand Army of Bretonnia, and honestly, as strong as the Grand Army is, maybe it's better to play this in a friendly Escalation League to where the list is not as strong and has a lot of very clearly, very easy to exploit weaknesses. That being said, I do feel like this list is a strong take on all comers list for an Errantry Crusade. Obviously, if you know your opponents, feel free to move things around. That makes sense. If you know you're going to be facing a lot of gun lines, Bretonnia has some flag options, some vow options to help you deal with ranged units, stuff like that. Just do what makes sense to you. And before I end this video, as one more quick aside, I want to do a hypothetical 2,000 point Errantry Crusade list where we're not using a Duke on Pegasus. A Duke on a Royal Pegasus is very strong, monsters are very strong, dragons are very strong, especially characters on dragons. And so I see more and more groups talking about doing escalation leagues or fun narrative leagues where they're not taking their big characters on their big dragons. And if you're in an escalation league like that, here's what I would do at 2,000 points. The list is very similar. We're just taking the points we would have spent on our Duke and spending them elsewhere now. The Duke is no longer a flyer, we are putting him back on the horse, and we are going to embed him in a unit, most likely our Grail Knights along with our Damsel. Because we no longer require his skills as a monster hunter, we are instead going to kit him out to hunt down characters. We are giving him the virtue of confidence so he cannot be denied a duel, and giving him the Morning Star of Fracassi. That way he denies your enemy their magic weapons, but you still have yours. And in those situations, I expect our Duke to come out on top most of the time. For the rest of the points, we've added the War Banner back into our Grail Knights. I like it there. I wish I had it there in my main list. And finally, with the rest of the points, I've added another paladin at a minimal level. Quite literally, we can't even afford a shield on him. But even without the extra investment, he is a multiplier inside one of your units of Knights Errant, and more importantly, he grants another radius of your reroll for Knights Errant. And I'm probably going to leave this video there. Errantry Crusade is a lot of fun to play. It's very flavorful for Bretonnia. It can be a source of frustration, but you know, it's nice to have the option, and if you get the chance, you should play around with it. As always, thanks for watching, and feel free to let me know in the comments how you would do things differently.